Thank you to the Architecture Foundation for this invitation. We're really excited to be able to share this body of work with you. From our time last year in 2019, we spent about 8 months building up to the Oslo Architecture Triennale or Triennale that was held in September. And so we'd like to go through the process of building a body of work that we did that really focuses in on work that looks to address the question of climate emergency within design, particularly from the perspective of the Global South and Sub-Saharan Africa in particular. So the dialogue will dissect the 8 months long process developed by our team, known as Hunguta, which is formed of Tomà Berlanda, Nerea Amorós Elorduy, Khensani de Klerk, Tao Klitzner, Lloyd, Sunniva, Viking, and myself. We're architects, designers, researchers, as well as teachers and artists who are either based in or work from the African continent. We will engage, hopefully, with the audience in a conversation focusing in on the process of conceiving this installation, co-producing the research, and the conversation will be loosely structured as a way to articulate the multifaceted positions herein, and how one understands in particular the Anthropocene and the South through a variety of languages, visual iconography, and material languages. So to start off, this is just an introduction into the call, which was led by Interrobang. And this was in October 2018, so almost a year before the exhibition, that the call was launched, which was really meant to challenge the supremacy of economic growth and investigate architectural alternatives to address this. So it was quite a varied call in that it not only asked responses from architects and urbanists, but also activists, novelists, and architects or ordinary citizens who were interested in how human and ecological matters were addressed within the profession. By November of 2018, we had formed our team, primarily from the invitation of Tomà Berlanda, to address this question. And at the time, some of the team members were still students, some were teaching or researching, others were practicing within architecture. And the idea was to bring our shared experiences to bear, address language. What do words, what concepts can be understood in a shared dialogue, and how to respond to the challenges of the Anthropocene as put forward by the curators within the format of the library. Issues of education were particular to our research, given the variety of experiences with early childhood centers within the group. And as well as that, there were issues of the design process itself, whether it was speculative, simulated, or how these visual elements could be articulated from a context of the South where there was quite an acute inequality. So from here on in, hopefully we'll be able to share with you these core concepts and how we try to capture them through an understanding of the process and how the content and the form related. When we tried to look into the form, one of the key tasks was how to form a repository of information. Something that was for us an antithesis just to ordinary taxonomy or conventional collections. So the process is designed and progressively reconfigured to explicitly include multiple viewpoints into southern ecosystems by using the logic of a kaleidoscope to survey a series of projects, happenings, and ways of being outside the primacy of the Western canon. We hope that this will coax a tacit review of the assembled universality of the growth and degrowth binary set up by the curators. So for us, in choosing the kaleidoscope, we really wanted to go beyond just a simple repository, but make something that was indeterminate, reflective, and in constant flux, in the same way that we see the built environment. So one of the key questions was this idea of the repository as a tool. So we had to address for ourselves, as Tomà will elaborate on, whether we weren't becoming curators within a curated exhibition. Tomà?
Thanks, Maxwell, and good evening. Yes, I think that it's important to stress on, to build on this point of what is an archive in terms of unpacking how our contribution to the Triennale was conceived of, but also how the work developed and why do we think it makes some sense to share the process, the 8-month-long process that led to it tonight, to this audience. And also this was a question that the curators of the Triennale asked of us as well, because they were concerned that since we didn't have a finite product to make a pitch out of, but we instead suggested that we would use the time from our initial proposal to the actual opening of the show to produce the research, that we would become curators in our own terms. And instead, I think what we learned from each other in the collaborative process was a way to use our creative agency and our creative ability to craft something that will hopefully tonight be able to split into these two components, one that speaks to the form and one that speaks to the content of the installation, but that are in fact linked together by the agency of design. Because if there's something that cuts across and unites all our different backgrounds and trajectories, is the belief and practice of design, be it through scholarly work or professional practice. And so I guess that the first attempts at finding form, precisely because in order to articulate the lens through which we were looking at the challenge, what does it mean to recognize degrowth, and how can one translate the specific meaning of the word outside of the context that the theoretical construct is formulated, was really to understand how are lenses and used to trace lines over specific environments. And so we found useful to put into question the role that the theodolite had in constructing cadastral lines from colonial powers into the global south, and conceptually shift that lens from one of oppression to one of displacement and one of and so from an idea of a theodolite to one of a kaleidoscope, the refraction that happens within the tube of the lens is what captured our interest. And from there on, the process of designing a form of some kind of object that needed to be fabricated in order to then be shipped and be part of the library, which was the overarching sort of like idea for the Oslo Triennale in 2019, was one of disobedience. So we're interested in pushing sort of the boundaries from our lived experience, from our everyday life to saying, how can we imagine an encounter and the impact of this installation for an audience that might be very unfamiliar with the realities we want to speak about? And so we explored how to resist the taxonomy of a classic display. We imagined, for instance, the replica, the one-to-one scale replica of a phone booth, something which is very prevalent in urban and rural Southern Africa, as a kiosk for airtime data, borrowing money, a bank of sorts. We explored transparent layering through, for example, different materials. But I think ultimately what we were pushing for is an experience, a journey. And so how to facilitate that? And so our sketches, and I think what is useful maybe for the audience to imagine that we never met as a team. And to this date, we have not managed to meet all together in one room. And I think we were living separately before the pandemic, and we were operating separately. And I think that so we had to find ways to share and work together across the boundaries. And our discussions continue to delve into trying to imagine and suggest these experiencing along the paradigm of growth, like an Advent calendar, if you like, with a set of initial words linked to degrowth. And we also sketched out different series of this kaleidoscopic effect that led to somehow thinking of a thick clay wall with hollows, inlets, and outlets, some kind of cabinet, of Wunder cabinet, of cabinet of curiosities that could, you know, showcase the different lenses. And in order to advance the process, we continued with design charrettes, where we, you know, asked ourselves different questions: how could translate different projects into displays, how confront the audience with something that is more rudimentary, transitional nature, or how to suggest the installation itself would introduce the concept and definition of the southern ecosystems. And ultimately, you know, through different iterations that were also discussed with the curators, we felt that a space needed to be fabricated to really lead to some form of abstract image, and some kind of as in the search for the abstraction of the form to define our lexicon, we really hope that the conceptual understanding of language, so how do we understand language, what is degrowth, could help facilitate for the audience the location of the different ecosystemic projects. And so ultimately what I'm sharing with you now and leading up to Tao and other colleagues to follow upon is enter a map, a collection of maps, a repository of different projects that allows to establish coordinates, not merely geographical, but layered, a stratigraphy of sorts, an act of resistance toward the global project of inequality that these ecosystemic projects make the installation then alive with. Tao?
We were constantly questioning the relationship of form, content, and research. While the location of ecosystemic projects in the South as a process started as a means to locate a reference point for our collective understanding of a Southern ecosystem and what Southern ecosystems are within the theme of degrowth, the space of the active archive or the active repository emerged. With each member of the group nominating projects we are or have been a part of, as well as putting forward projects we have learned about or heard of, which we felt were engaging with the themes of Southern ecosystemic degrowth, the list still growing and by no means definitive, it was quickly realized that the capturing of projects identified as Southern references could not be held in one word or in 3 words. Neither could the projects be read as a collective with large text. Terms and words used to hold one project were starting to emerge when capturing another. For example, to be restricted to 3 terms such as education, research, and community engagement can be used in reference to a kaleidoscope of projects in the South. As reference, the Space of Good Hope Studio is a community-based master's research studio located at the University of Cape Town, realized and facilitated by lecturers Fadli Isaacs and Melinda Silverman, focusing on everyday narratives within the township Delft in Cape Town, South Africa, where research is used as a design tool, embedded in workshops with students in Delft as pictured on the slide, and conversations with community members forming as the foundation for ecosystemic mappings, readings, understandings, and imaginings. So too, the terms education, research, and community engagement apply to the ecosystemic work of violence prevention through urban upgrading in Khayelitsha, VPUU, whose baseline research of metropolitan Cape Town identified the under-resourced townships in Cape Town with the highest crime rates. Khayelitsha was identified as the township in which VPUU commenced their strategy, a partnership between the residents of Khayelitsha, the city of Cape Town, and the German Development Bank. VPU's primary concern was to assist in crime reduction through the hypothesis that reclaiming the public domain and positively occupying dangerously labeled spaces will reduce opportunities for crime. The image on the slide capturing a moment of the urban square designed by TKLA as an urban forecourt to pre-existing buildings, and the new library that was designed by CCNIA, one of VPUU's active boxes, which has become known as the living room of Harare Khayelitsha. The limitation on terms was not refined enough to capture projects' layers and complexities that are located within the southern ecosystem. And so it was at the point where we had nominated 30 projects roundabout out of the current 70 projects that are in the repository, when we started to weave out themes in terms of society, settlement, land tenure, connectivity, demography, and culture, gradually refining the grain of sub-themes. As a result, as illustrated, a qualitative method of archiving, a foundation for the resultant form that the installation realized, a space in which the projects can be read through their embedded layers, avoiding the singularization or isolation of a project, a space in which the projects can be read as part of a collective of Southern responses and Southern thought, a space of connectivity and conversation between ecosystemic responses, a space in which terms and definitions are being constantly refined and challenged, and a digital platform that could be shared and added to. Through the months, constantly reworking the terms and words used as a means to frame degrowth, the following core terms emerged: society, holding community and dwelling; settlement, the rural and urban; land tenure, land and legality; connectivity, network and technology; demography, which holds environment and migration; and culture, that holds education and art. As seen in the image, the understanding of projects to these terms, held by the sub-themes, allowing the projects to be archived in a space that expresses their full complexity, relationality, fluidity, and ecosystemic nature.
Thanks, Tao. So behind each of these different categories was embedded the research as a language or as a text. And society, which encompassed community and dwelling, anchored the collective projects and spatial practices researched. Each spatial practice in some way involved primary design or construction from people that are not usually considered, quote, professional. The sub-Saharan African dwelling has traditionally described the social hierarchy and cultural mores in communities. The built environment is not only a venue for private desires, but also for public expression and innovation. The promises and challenges of the 21st century highlight the conflicts presented by the inherited structures of colonialism, post-colonialism, and indigenous values. A key example is pictured in this slide of the work of Slum Dwellers International, an organization that works in Kenya, South Africa, and Uganda. similar to collaborative media advocacy platform CMAP in Nigeria, which also carries out extensive community-led enumeration in low-income communities. So the research really was presented as a visual narrative, which we hoped would highlight the relationships between each of the projects and bring to fore some of the important characteristics. Say, for example, the relationship between a shack, which we defined as a small dwelling, often used by building reclaimed or repurposed or refuse material that is endemic to low-income communities in Africa, and how localization as a key word, which we use to emphasize the adaptive practices, as well as the ability to harness local materials, social capital, and community members in the development of socially engaged built environments. This video highlights the example from a pair of the research team, that being Tomà Berlanda and Sunniva Viking, who worked in Zambia to build an early childhood development center on behalf of UNICEF. That was seen as an example of how the practices we wanted to highlight established or nurtured well-being. In that sense, a holistic approach to the state of being comfortable, healthy, or happy in the built environment, taking into consideration physical or ecological conditions, such as access to healthy food, as well as other social or psychological factors. In identifying the locations which were of interest to us, we primarily split settlements according to their rural or urban nature, but also considered refugee and predominantly natural environments, so as not to prejudice our work to include only informal urban settlements. Rural settlements in particular were seen as a way of highlighting the socio-economic needs presented by the climate crisis, wherein ecological sustainability, the use of local materials, accessibility, and adaptability within design, planning, and building is mirrored in urban settlements as well. Rural settlements in that case echo a much used buzzword, resilience, which is defined by the OECD as the ability for communities to absorb, recover, and prepare for future shocks, whether they be economical, environmental, social, or institutional. So within our research, we really wanted to focus on resilient communities as a way to promote sustainable development, well-being, and inclusive growth. Herein is a video which became a defining part of the research, highlighting the work of ASA Studios, which was founded by Nerea and Tomà, who are part of the research team, in how a community was engaged in building a school for refugee communities in Rwanda. Land tenure became another very key focus of the research, seeing as Africa's landmass is greater than the entirety of the United States, all of China, the Indian subcontinent, and pretty much all of Europe as well. Land ownership in sub-Saharan Africa is defined by many official and informal systems beyond just ordinary leasehold or freehold tenure. Most countries have a legacy of indigenous communal land rights that have been amalgamated into communal land appropriations, as well as post-colonial land-related displacement. Many communities, local authorities, and organizations work to develop access to basic services, land, tenure rights, and affordable housing through the spatial practices that we highlighted. The research took into consideration the work of Selwyn Carr, which focuses on economics, restitution, and development on the continent, which asks for a different kind of thinking, particularly luminary thinking, which considers anthropology as a way to highlight economic and cultural processes. Pictured here is a work of urban reblocking done in support of the Empower Shack project by local citizens, municipal planning authorities, and urban think tank and Kailami in Cape Town, South Africa. The project is indicative of the needs highlighted thus far. Connectivity became another very important means of anchoring the different projects, defining the ecosystems as both interconnected and interlacing parts. The spatial practices that we chose were a sequence of involuntary moves that challenge shelter, health, nutrition, education, and economic opportunities within communities. And we saw technology not as something speaking only to digital technologies, but also the indigenous knowledge present within the continent, as well as the urban hacks that came through within different societies across informal settlements. So a question that we can ask is, what exactly is the South? And Nerea may be online to elaborate on this.
Yeah, thank you, Maxwell. This is a term we questioned as we developed the Degrowth project for Oslo, as we were questioning the term Degrowth itself, which seemed to be based mostly on what the societies of consumption understood by degrowth. However, will it be the same conception in the geographies we as a group belong to, live, and feel a connection to? So this question led us to the bigger question of where do we belong? To the South, to Southern Africa, and what really is the South? The question you just posed. As we discussed amongst the members of Hunguta, academia and international institutions tend to describe and see the world in binary, right? Black and white, us versus them, in an effort to make it more palatable, be able to produce global policies, for example. But these linear understandings are initially and foremost devised and used by institutions and individuals with Anglo-European frameworks. These terms have changed over time as the worldview of these powerful nations change. Some examples are Occident and Orient, the West and the rest, and more recently, global North versus global South. But the questions are then, how do these terms help in the understanding and representation of the world's pluralism? Are they not reminiscent of colonial power imbalances? And more importantly for us, is to understand how are these terms helpful in a decolonization effort, which descriptors will the kaleidoscopic constellation of world communities choose to describe themselves and the world, especially which ones will Southern African collectives use. So how do we as a collective and as individuals feel about the terms Global South and Global North? Can we as a collective speak from and about the South, about a Southern African perspective? And if so, how? How can we do that? Which terms would we like to use? So we tried to answer those and other questions by doing, as Tao explained before, by selecting, dissecting, analyzing, and reassembling a number of built environment interventions happening in the region. In this work of assembling, one of the topics that seemed relevant to us and where many of the projects analyzed touched upon was demography, as related to environments and migration. So one of these topics is forced migration, and specifically the case of the long-term camp, so prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa. So long-term camps in the region are not usually the focus of new species and academic studies, which tend to bear a strong European bias and focus on geographies and cases more relevant to that continent, such as the Middle East, the crossing of the Mediterranean, or cases that appear more urgent, such as the latest global emergency. Most of the 70 long-term camps in East Africa, created as far as 1958, are quite invisible, even if they are permanent home to millions of people. These camps have been described by Anglo-European philosophers and social scientists as spaces of limbo and exception for decades. They have been described by humanitarians, which are organizations mostly from Europe, North America, and few other nations, as spaces of aid where refugees are helpless victims in need. These camps do pose ecological, social, political threats to their inhabitants and their surroundings. Many of their inhabitants are in dire conditions with lack of material and economic means. However, these are also spaces of creation, learning environments for young children, spaces for collaboration, and for political growth. They are certainly human settlements. I would say they are even proto-urban. For example, in the image here above, we see a part of a mural making project led by creative assemblages based in Kampala, and a group of refugees, architecture students, and a group of Rwandan traditional imigongo artisans, that is this mural making technique in Rwanda, that we're trying to beautify and make more child-friendly some of the spaces in Kiziba refugee camp, the oldest camp in Rwanda. A project that one can find in our repository. Other relevant topics within demography is inequality and feasibility, which brings me again to the idea of the outsider lenses. Through former colonizer lenses, sub-Saharan Africa is defined as overpopulated. Demographic growth and large migratory movements towards urban environments have changed cities, planned under colonial rule, which were usually segregated, unequal, and detrimental to the vulnerable, into sprawling, confusing, and often dirty and insecure hubs that defy definition, especially for the Anglo-European lexicon. But is that the only reality of these settlements? What if these urban developments will self-define? What if the concept of city developed in Europe and metropolis developed in the US is not representative here? As a collective, we try to understand what do these large urban centers represent for their inhabitants and for those that want to migrate to them through the analysis of the built environment interventions developed there. Other questions raised by the analysis of ongoing projects in the region regarding migration, urbanization, and demographics are, for example, whether it would be useful to get rid of these binary descriptions of the world, especially in the case of the South and Southern Africa. How would a more kaleidoscopic and changing view and representation of the world impact this region, its migration, its urban development? Which are the ongoing invisible projects by migrants, refugees, and the groups of people that serve as their hosts? And what are local artists, refugees, architects, vulnerable urban dwellers, and other actors doing with these situations? How would they classify themselves and the work that they do?
So Khensani, I think, is leading us to the close of the research body to focus in on culture.
Yes, of course. So since Oslo, we continue to reflect on our work in response to current happenings in academia and practice in the architectural sphere. And sometimes this resurfaces events from the past that continue to add to the database, which Tao explained as being by no means definitive. And so we bring a few examples in this presentation, whilst looking at a few that we included in the repository. And on the left in the blue, you'll see an example by the Graduate School of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg, which ran a lecture series that encourages, as many others do, an involvement of multiple voices and perspectives on themes that similarly question these Western canonical architectural habits. And of course, this brings us back to the process of uncovering methods across the Sub-Saharan Africa that put these thematics into media through artistic spatial practice. And that, of course, leads on to the example that we see on the right of this slide, which is a project featured by cinema it's called Cinema na Escada in Mozambique by Estudio Cinco, who reinvigorates forgotten, abandoned urban spaces through spatial intervention. And yeah, by constantly reflecting on our own work and that of others in sub-Saharan Africa, by sharing and presenting constantly, we challenge the intentions of our own work, and hopefully also challenge the fluctuating outcomes through these various interpretations at different points in time. And so moving on to the next slide, we also think that another way of learning and exchanging comes through the act of reclaiming space. And of course, as mentioned, we also find a deep interest in the notion and reality of flux through ephemeral and transient spatial interventions that speak to a sort of disobedient energy. All in all, reclaiming space, conveying messages of importance, sparking conversations and disrupting norms, and in doing so revealing alternative ways of practicing and learning in the architectural sphere. And so the execution and involvement of such projects begins to positively complicate the role of the architect as the urban intervener. And as we can see on the left-hand side of this slide, the Black Lives Matter response in public domain came predominantly from communities in support of the movement. Of course, many different disciplines in that community. And on the right-hand side, we see a more a response within the realm of architecture and urban design. Of course, there is creative room where spatial practitioners use these tactics to spread meaningful messages in public spaces, exploring the impact of scale and visibility. And so the project on the right, that you would see in that little card of ours, is by a Rwandan organization called Kurema Karema Kwiga, and it's the one that we included in the repository, in the database. And they specifically bring a range of stakeholders together through strategic partnerships to deliver meaningful projects with shared value. And they use a variety of mediums to do this. And in this case, murals across Rwanda. And when we look at the theme of education, which Tao extended on, we realize that it is a very big theme in our work. And in fact, our collective is a result of learning from one another at various points of our architectural interests. And more specifically on this slide, we think of how to contextualize knowledge through content and media, which reflects a moment in time and captures the richness of sites in which we work and in which the projects that we've included work in. The images seen on the slide come from, or at least on the left-hand side, the photograph comes from the Decolonize Architecture, Planning and Geomatics Open Classroom that saw staff and students come together in 2016 to discuss what strategies, modes, and content could indeed respond to calls for a decolonial education at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And of course, projects would be happening concurrently, parallel, some predated others, some acted in response. And in this case, as Tao had mentioned on the right, from our repository, the project mentioned earlier by Fadli Isaacs and Melinda Silverman incorporated into the University of Cape Town School of Architecture as a master's research studio focuses on participatory architectural processes in housing and the informal settlement of Delft in Cape Town, South Africa. And so we are constantly encouraged by projects that are both informal and formal, that are hosted outside of institutions, and within that to disrupt and hone in to that disobedient and quite productive creative practice. And this we find becomes quite fitting in response to flux and for spaces that change quickly and are not suited to the slow frameworks of institutions that architecture tends to find itself in. And so we, in the same sense that institutions assume a foundation of permanence and stasis, we explored assumptions about the static capturing of conventional repositories. And so our engagement as a collective and the sort of conception and creation of our exhibition at the Oslo Triennale in that intervention was constantly challenged and inspired by trying to figure out how to react to flux without contradicting it. And if we found ourselves in the position where we did begin to contradict it, how would it be able to provoke and change and hopefully positively relapse into flux again in reacting to the time in which the repository was created and how people reacted to it and how people react to it now. And so we find that these processes reveal possibilities of learning, teaching, and exchanging. And of course, we look to looking to our engagement and our involvement in the Oslo Triennale, we found that our processes were helpfully disrupted and constantly reined in by the parameters of the curators and the Triennale theme of degrowth itself. And so we would get often quite caught up in our processes, and our collective name is quite emblematic of telling ourselves to also know when to call it enough. And so our collective name, which is Hunguta, engages with this, and it means to decrease, or it's the closest term to degrowth in Xitsonga, which is a Southern African language, and can also be used instructively, meaning to heed action or indicating that it is enough and in fact should be pulled back. And this was and continues to be fitting for how we engage with our brainstorming processes and our approaches to production. And so we'll probably get into the intervention itself. Tomà.
Thanks, Khensani. Yes, and I hope that by now it has become apparent to the audience how one of the leitmotifs and modes of engagement that as a collective we really embrace is that of asking questions, not because we think we can find answers to them or definite answers to them, but because it's a way for us to advance this shared form of knowledge production. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier on, we never managed to meet as a team yet in person. And unfortunately, also, I was the only one of the team who actually saw the installation physically built. And for those of you who are familiar with Sverre Fenn's addition to the National Architectural Museum in Oslo, in Norway, this is a fairly rigid, square-planned pavilion in reinforced concrete with 4 central columns that carry a floating roof, surrounded mostly by glazing. And within that structure, the curators in Terabang had placed a cross that was to host the library of elements of the exhibition, and had allocated us a corner spot where the structure of the kaleidoscope, a triangular 2.5 meters in size, almost sculptural tower, appeared as an hermetic structure. Not really revealing from the outside what was going on inside, a silent structure by many means, of which we could only imagine, most of us, the 3-dimensional experience through a scale model that Khensani had built in Johannesburg at some point during the development process, and which we became fascinated with in just perusing the movies that it provided us with. And I think that, I mean, hopefully also one of the other things that emerges from this whole repertoire is the whole question of the movie, and why the video became the format in which we relied upon in terms of mesmerizing also possibly the audience, because the original videos went through a huge process of post-production that Maxwell mostly led in order to be translated into the precise triangular form that then could be fed to the projector, that then would shower if one will, the audience upon entering this triangular kaleidoscope. And it was a soundless installation, which will be ideally looking for opportunities to replicate with sound. So if there's any curators listening, don't hesitate to give us a call, because we think that the idea is not to be satisfied with the form per se, and also we are not sort of claiming any innovation in the entire process, but rather we think that we were able to explore the boundaries that the theme provided us with in terms of creative work. So if we did not invent the kaleidoscope itself, I think that what we're trying to share tonight is the fact that the entire 8-month-long process plus this component of self-reflection allows us really to put together a body of work that speaks to the theme and offers some clues to advancing knowledge. And I think on that, with some images from the experience that I had of that installation, I'll leave it to Khensani to try to sum things up.
I suppose that segues quite well into a very brief sort of questioning that would hopefully bring some challenges to us from the audience in how we've, as Tomà had mentioned, worked together as a collective pre-crisis, or let's say pre-COVID, in response to a series of different events and, as you would, crises across sub-Saharan Africa, and at all costs trying to avoid being definitive and creating room for the sort of critique that we constantly gave to one another in the process of creating this intervention and our continued lines of work. And so we found this a really helpful and interesting process, which we've been really happy to share with you. And these multiple mediums for increased legibility remain a very important and central part of our work, and so I suppose a very mutual string along the very different trajectories that we all follow. And of course, one would ask, where were we after some sort of big event happens? And in this case, we try to present an alternative question to that, which is, how do we constantly reflect on processes moving forward, and in doing so, keeping in flux? Any questions, please?
Thank you so much to all of you. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat quite yet, but if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. But yeah, maybe I'm just going to stop your screen.
Thanks. There's one that has been shared, Rosie, which asks, what are the next steps you guys have in mind or in the pipeline? And thanks for the presentation, really cool work. So I will pose that to Tomà and Khensani. I'm just going to change my view.
Khensani, why don't you go ahead?
I suppose it's difficult to say, right? We act in, and of course anyone in the collective should interject. I think we act in response to many different contexts, and we find ourselves also occupying spaces outside of the supposed global south, whilst having a very deep interest for the places within the global south or within the southern ecosystem, which are constantly also shifting. And as Nerea mentioned earlier in the presentation, that we have to constantly also check ourselves on that. And I think the attempted simple answer to that would be going back to how to increase the legibility of architectural and spatial work so that it can become something that is quite as participatory as the work that we sought to include in this library that we constantly end up gravitating towards. And it grows, it's growing. So if anyone wants to commission a project, that's also, by all means.
Yeah, I think what's really key as well is in how we try to present a representational method, or as well as a method of engagement into the work that could suit a wide variety of audiences, right? So it wasn't particularly coded within an architectural language, right? Of particularly, say, a written language or a visual language, right? So it almost became quite rudimentary in the sort of dot matrix presentation, or gamified in the kaleidoscopic installation, which we thought was also important in representing these participatory spatial practices that also don't rely on this knowledge accrued through an architectural education. I think, we really try to move away from the conventions of, say, architectural exhibitions that, say, focused in on well-known projects, right? And highlighted projects that, in a way, sometimes the built nature of it wasn't so evident. So particularly within the mapping projects or land rights projects within rural Kenya were very important to us, or in the Congo, where just the fundamental access to space became sort of the anchor or the fulcrum from which architecture can arise. So questions that may or may not be considered within, say, a European or an English perspective, where cities as well as rural environments are quite well built, where it's more about how can one use existing spaces and buildings. So for us, this idea of the new was important, and within the presentation as well. And also because we've all gone further afield. So Teo, for example, you've taken your learnings to Israel, which I think is also interesting. And Nerea, you started a project in Carolina, haven't you, at the moment? So I think you're muted.
Trying.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think in what's, responding to the question, and also what Khensani was saying, I think a little bit the idea is like, how will different people represent themselves? So in this case is, Southern African ecosystems, right? But the idea is that like there are all these different ecosystems that up to now, we all use these global South, global North. But why do we use that? Why do we divide by the equator? Like, and why, how is that useful? More than just why? Like, how is that useful going forward? And as we know that these descriptors that tend to be binaries change over time, and seems that, this year it might be a good time for a change. How are we going to change that? Like, how would we like to call, our interventions, or the interventions that we have been analyzing? Or how will we like to relate to each other? Not only like the South and the North. How about South-South? How about within East Africa or within Sub-Saharan Africa? But
yeah. Tomà, do you want to come in there?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I have a lot to add. I think that what we hope that emerges through this reflection, also in response to the question, I mean, the simple fact, or not so simple really, of organizing tonight's presentation almost a year after the installation went up on show in Oslo was a decision that was taken after long deliberation, but it really allowed us a period of self-reflection on the work, because at some point one doesn't have that space to do it and needs sort of similar platforms in order to share the work and be able to construct also the representation, again to Maxwell's points, on how does one share it, and which is only partly an answer to the why is one sharing it, but I think that the self-reflection also allows to critically re-examine it and find possibly also its limitations as ways to imagine new projects. And I think, you know, if I look at the trajectories that each one of the group members is taking in their own, you know, individual name is really apparent. And so I think that's the strength of the collective project that is put on show tonight. And I think it also points to some geographical imaginaries that deliberately expand on disciplinary boundaries, right? Because they resist the idea of being boxed into, is this a piece of art? Is this a piece of architecture? Is this a piece of urbanism? Is a piece of scholarly work? Whereas they say they want to speak to the everyday, to the lives that we live, and that in the context of the pandemic, then appear also accentuated, but that almost become normal by the fact that we have been, we have chosen to work remotely from the beginning. And so almost, you know, 2 years down the line, this has become an accepted mode of practice that we don't necessarily love, but we try to exploit the opportunities for. So, Maxwell.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's great. I mean, I know, like, so within all of us, there is this continued push towards, as Tomà said, questioning the work on our own work within practice or within academia. So Nerea's just recently published with UCL Press. Khensani is putting together her thesis, and likewise. And it is just this idea that the work to speak across disciplines needs to be conducted in a way that is interdisciplinary. And it was for me particularly instrumental in charting the course that Tomà speaks to of going forward. So Khensani's now at Cambridge. I hope to be at Oxford in October, pandemic transit permitting. And it is this idea of, you know, how does one build knowledge bases from within and without? As Nerea said, you know, knowledge is not centered on geographies. And how can we expand on the practice of questioning, of comparative research further from ecosystems into our other work.